Shalom and welcome to this edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. Now, today we're going to take a look at the piece of real estate that is the most important of anywhere on planet Earth, past, present, and future. The very specific place that God has had an amazing plan, and his plan will continue. It's where the temple once stood and where one day, according to prophecy, it will stand again. Now we know that God has identified Jerusalem itself as the most special city because he said, but now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there. Now what we're looking at right here is modern day Jerusalem. It's about 1 million people. Obviously, it spreads out into a vast area. But the city itself has always had this special significance. Okay? Now when the ancient rabbis kind of took a look at what the city looked like land-wise as far as the actual landforms and the valleys around it, they kind of got the idea what God is talking about, even in terms of what the city actually looks like, how he formed it. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you look closely at the valleys around ancient Jerusalem, that's called David's city. That was probably about 3,000 years ago, only 7 or 8 acres, very small. And then, of course, David's son Solomon built that temple upon the Temple Mount. But let's draw some lines around those valleys. Okay, there's a line right there. And let's go around this valley right here. Now, the lower part of it was not settled until later, but eventually it was settled into all of Jerusalem. In fact, even during the Old Testament, during the time of Hezekiah, a lot of that was turned into part of the city. But if we look at this right here, you might wonder, okay, what is that? What do these lines represent? The rabbis looked at it and they could see the letter Shin. Okay, that'd be like an SH sound in the Hebrew alphabet. And that letter Shin always stood for Shaddai or El Shaddai, which is the protector name of God. El Shaddai means that God Almighty, God, the protector of Israel. So they literally could see that, even by the way he designed this special city of Jerusalem. Okay? Now, we know about Jerusalem, and let's look specifically at the very center of God's focus. Here are the arrows pointing right there, and I'm going to draw a line around it. And this is what we call the Temple Mount area. It's about 37 or 38 acres. There it is. Now the question is, why? Okay, why is that the center of God's focus? And that's today's topic. It's so very, very, very important to understand. All right, so let's get into this, and here we go. All right, the ancient Jerusalem, you can see that what's in the foreground there is ancient Jerusalem. Was about 3,000 years ago, sometimes called David's city. That was the original Jerusalem. Up here, on this higher ground, it was eventually called the Temple Mount, originally called Mount Moriah. Okay, now Mount Moriah, if we look at it in terms of what does that mean in terms of Hebrew, Moriah is from the root of the word Moriah is from the word Ra'ah, which means sea, and Yah, which is short for Yahweh, which means Yahweh sees, if we take it actually literally. So Yahweh sees this spot, and this spot right here is going to be absolutely central, Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah in the scriptures is called the mountain of the Lord, often. Okay? Now, the question is, what happened first up here? So let's look at it. I told you we're going to go past, present, and future. Now, the ancient rabbis said what happened first up here was creation. So in other words, this is where Adam was created, where Adam and Eve were. This is actually part of the Garden of Eden, according to what they're saying. And this kind of is going to follow through all of history now. So let's look at that. What does this mean? Where did this come from? All right. So was the Garden of Eden part of this mountain of the Lord, part of Mount Moriah? If we look at these verses in Ezekiel, we can see the reading that says you, and this is in reference to Satan at that time, were in Eden, the garden of God. And then it says this, you were on the holy mount of God. Now, the holy mount of God is that Mount Moriah, all through the scriptures. It's called the mountain of God. That's it. So this is a kind of a clue here that this may have been part of Garden of Eden, that Mount Moriah was actually part of the Garden of Eden. And in this reference here, that Satan was there. Now, if we look here, this is a closer in view of that Temple Mount. Right here is the center of the Temple Mount, okay? And that's called the Dome of the Rock. That's what it's called today. And it was built by Muslims many, many years ago. And we'll look at that story in a little bit. But it's in the center of Mount Moriah, okay? It's called the Dome of the Rock. The center of Mount Moriah, or inside that Dome of the Rock, is this. That's the rock that's inside. So what they're saying is, the ancient rabbis are saying, according to the scriptures, that Adam and Eve, the rock of creation is right there. It's right in the center of the Temple Mount. Okay? So that's the idea that they're portraying here. Now, of course, sin entered. And the first mention of the plan of redemption was this: I will put enmity between you, Satan. Okay, now remember, Satan was there. He observed the Garden of Eden. And the woman is Israel in the Bible. And between your offspring and hers, he, the Messiah, will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Okay, now we mentioned that last time about the David and Goliath story, exactly what that meant, that first prophecy about the coming Messiah. So God's plan of redemption is going to continue. And we're going to fast forward ahead to the time of Abraham. All right? And this is where Mount Moriah is going to come into play again. And all of this is incredibly significant. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, and that is going to be Mount Moriah, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham and called from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." All right. Now, so what we have here is a picture, kind of a shadow of the future of what is going to happen in this place. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord, that's Mount Moriah, it will be provided. So that ram, that male lamb, was caught by its horns. And we've mentioned this before, but that become very significant. Now, years later, 2,000 years later approximately, Jesus said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and he was glad." Wow. So that picture just continued on into this, what happened on that Passover. And because that ram was caught in a thicket, the male lamb, by its horn, the horn become the symbol of redemption, literally the sound of redemption, and many other things too. Become very, very significant. Now, God's dwelling place is going to be in a coming temple eventually. Where was that first mentioned in the scriptures? Way back here at the Exodus. The Song of Moses is where it's first mentioned. This is where God indicated this is what's going to be happening eventually. "You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance." There we go. "The place, O Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary. O Lord, your hands established. The Lord will reign forever and ever." So that idea of this sanctuary is first mentioned back here at the Exodus. All right. So that's how we have an indication, Moses did, that something is going to be built eventually. Now, first, though, before that temple was built, there was going to be a tabernacle built, which is portable, that they could take to the wilderness, of course. The tabernacle was built at the foot of Mount Sinai, 11 months after the Exodus. And God gave the directions to Moses. Make the tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you. Okay, this is at the foot of Mount Sinai. And of course, Moses was up there a couple different times. When the tabernacle was finished, this happened. And the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The word become flesh and dwelt among us. Now, that verse right there is interesting because dwelt in Greek means to pitch a tent or to tabernacle. And this is a reference, of course, to Jesus, who eventually is going to be born. So it's even interesting that reference right there is reference really, in a sense, to tabernacling or to tabernacle. Now, God had only 2 chapters in his book about creation. And I know we have a lot of questions about creation, but we probably couldn't begin to understand it. It's so complicated. And I mentioned this before, but there's 16 chapters about his house. So clearly God's heart is about his house, his dwelling with his people. He's demonstrating his desire to be with his people. So right from the beginning. So, and then we have just kind of a little whirlwind through history. This is the route of the Exodus. Took 40 years. Lots of things happened. Eventually they got up. You can see the red arrow is up above on Mount Nebo, just the northern part of the Dead Sea. And that's where they're going to cross. And that's where they did cross, right here. Okay, they crossed the Jordan River on into Israel at this point when the water's backed up. And that's another whole story, but I'm just doing a quick overview here. And the tabernacle is going to be taken to a place called Shiloh, which I have circled right there for 369 years total. Now, this is Shiloh today. That's the Tel, or the ancient Shiloh. You can see where it's labeled. And it is believed that the tabernacle sat just to its right there for that many years. Now, they made a mistake in terms of the tabernacle eventually sitting there, and the Ark of the Covenant being, of course, the key piece of furniture in it. When I say they, I mean the Israelites, because they took it out of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and they brought it into battle. They thought it could be like a good luck charm against the Philistines. Well, that was a big, big mistake. It was not God's plan. It was captured by the Philistines, eventually causing them all kinds of distress. And eventually, it got back to Israel again. And this is that valley. We talked about these valleys last time, the Sorek Valley. You can see Zorah, that's where Samson was from. But this valley right here is where eventually the Ark of the Covenant is going to be brought back. So it's going to come back to Israel again. Now, years later, on Mount Moriah was a threshing floor for a group called the Jebusites. They're the ones that owned the land of Israel before David captured it and turned it into Jerusalem. Okay, about 1000 BC, God told David to buy this threshing floor from Araunah the Jebusite. Okay, so God is going to tell him to buy this. Now, a threshing floor are normally put in a place that's rocky, kind of on a higher area, or it's windy, because they could kind of separate the grain from the chaff easily when they use the wind. So Mount Moriah, the mountain of the Lord, become a threshing floor, and God is telling David to buy it back from the Jebusites. He did. He obeyed God, all right, to the words of his servant Gad, for 50 shekels. He purchased it. So he did that. So this land becomes part of Israel again. And the significance of a threshing floor, as I mentioned, this is really a place in the Bible. It's kind of a symbolic of the idea of judgment. And all through the scriptures, it actually is. It's separating the chaff from the grain. It's literally that. And this is an illustration maybe what that looked like in a flat open place. So Mount Moriah was a threshing floor at that point in history. But now something else is going to happen on this threshing floor. Okay, what's going to happen before that is David is going to bring that ark back to Jerusalem. We're following this all through kind of a whirlwind story here, among great celebrations. All right, it had actually, after it came back from the Philistines, it sat in one other location for a little while. Now he's going to bring it back to Jerusalem getting ready for something bigger here. And then, of course, David's son is going to build a house for my name. That was God's direction. And he did. He built this beautiful temple. Now, this is a permanent structure, now a temple, not a tabernacle. About 400 years later, in 586 BC, Babylon destroyed the first temple. Okay, so we had that temple sitting there for 400 years, and a lot of history took place. Eventually, because of Israel's disobedience, God allowed the Babylonians to capture it and they literally destroyed the temple and took many of the Jews into exile, into ancient Babylon, which is Iraq, present-day Iraq today. And by the way, some of them actually stayed in Iraq till fairly recently, until they were persecuted and they came back. Many of them came back to Israel. But then after that, then we have Persia. And Cyrus of Persia, which would be present-day Iran, allowed the Jews to return and to rebuild their temple in 538 BC. The temple was rebuilt with their permission. It actually even helped a little bit. So Cyrus and the Persians were helpful. It was called Zerubbabel's temple, but it didn't look like Solomon's temple. Okay, many of the priests who were old enough to remember Solomon's temple, they wept aloud because they said, "This is not like the other one we had." But at least they had a temple. Then we're moving ahead. In 17 AD, we have Herod enlarging this temple area, vastly enlarging it, and to a 38-acre, what we call today the Temple Mount, which I initially showed you in the first picture. So that's going to happen at this point. This is what we think it probably looked like, something like this. It was beautiful. It's just fantastic. It's one of the most beautiful structures in the world, but very, very important. Now, how did he do this? Well, if you look at this diagram here, see in the middle where it says Solomon's? Well, Solomon's temple sat kind of in the middle of what become Herod's Temple Mount. Now, what do I mean by that? What happened? Well, Herod, what he did, if you follow these red lines, he built a massive retaining walls all the way around it to support another platform on top of Solomon's temple. So in other words, he kind of created a whole new floor above it. And if you think about that, beneath the Temple Mount today, there is all kinds of incredible artifacts down there, obviously, because it's right on top of the old temple, Solomon's temple. But look how much bigger it is. It's much bigger. It was massive retaining walls, many of them over 100 feet high. This is a picture, kind of an indication of what it probably looked like. And of course, the temple sits in the middle of the Temple Mount. And the massive retaining walls were quarried from beneath Jerusalem. I've been in this quarry. It's really quite amazing. They dug, or Herod's men they carved massive rocks out of this quarry to bring back to the temple to create this wall, this huge retaining wall to support this big temple. Now, I'm going to show you a picture right here of the biggest of all these big rocks, or I should say blocks that they created. This one right here that goes all the way down there is 44.6 feet. It's a total of almost 10 feet high, and it weighs 570 tons. Now, this is at the bottom of the Temple Mount. This is actually beneath what is called the Western Wall. Some of these were just massive. We really don't know how they even moved them. They didn't use any mortar. These blocks were set right on top of each other. So it was really quite a project. So the Herod, a master builder, did all this to create this Temple Mount because he wanted to please the Jews. The temple itself was 17 stories high, marble and gold, plated 3 inches thick. It took 10,000 priests to build it. These two giant columns in front of it kind of represented God's feet, is how they viewed this. But it was just absolutely stunningly beautiful. This is exactly Mount Moriah. This is the very, very same place, that rock of creation, and all the threshing floor and all these things that happened. Now, the ultimate fate of Herod's temple, you remember when Jesus came down into Jerusalem on that Passover, the one where he's crucified and resurrected, and he started crying because he knew, and he sobbed loudly. Okay, and I'll just kind of go through this quickly, because the people were waving palm branches at him, and he knew that they didn't understand what his initial mission was. They thought he was going to be this son of David, the son of David that was going to free them from the Romans. They were sick of the persecution and the taxes and all the horrible things. But he knew if you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. Okay? So they sobbed. Why did Jesus sob loudly? Because he knew they didn't understand. He didn't understand at all. Plus, Jesus could see clearly what's going to happen. What's going to happen because they didn't understand. What's going to happen is that temple will be destroyed 40 years later, roughly 40 years later, about 70 A.D. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. Jesus knew this was going to happen. He's saying this. They will dash you to the ground and children within your walls. This horrific event that the Romans did, they destroyed this temple. On the very same day, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. This happened. Okay, this happened the very same day, not the same year, obviously, but the same day of the year. Titus ordered all the buildings level except for 3 towers of Herod's palace. All the citizens were executed, sold into slavery, save for the games in the marina, which a lot of them would have been killed with the lions. And the arena means the Colosseum in Rome. Infants are thrown from the top of the wall. People were burned alive. The streets were choked with dead bodies. 11,000 prisoners died of starvation waiting for their execution. So this is absolutely horrific. And that's what Jesus was sobbing about. Other starving Jews who tried to escape were crucified, up to 500 a day. There were crosses all over the place here. According to Josephus, more than 1 million people perished, 100,000 sold into slavery. Now, jumping ahead, so that temple's gone, obviously, and the Romans have full control. This guy, Emperor Hadrian, in 135 AD, he sacked all of the rest of Jerusalem and made it a completely Roman town. Now, parts of Jerusalem were still somewhat Jewish, but Hadrian wanted to take all of that away. He even changed the name of Israel, okay, which of course means Yisrael, or in Hebrew, Yisrael, means struggle with God. El is God. So struggle with God. And that's, of course, what Israel has done through its history. It struggled to try to follow God, and so many times it failed. So he turned it into Syro-Palestina, which, of course, eventually they shortened it to just Palestine. I mentioned that before, too. So that's where the name Palestine came from. This guy, Hadrian. If you go to Jerusalem today, you'll even see parts of the Roman city. Here's part of it here. This is called a Cardo. Remember those? We've looked at those before. That was a very pagan place in all of Roman cities, where all the enticements of immorality were along the Cardo. And you can actually see one of these in Jerusalem because Hadrian had Jerusalem built into a Roman-type city. Now, and there was a temple built of Hadrian. Actually, this happened after he died, about 145, to the chief Roman god Jupiter. This is built right here on that very same spot. That's why I'm going through this, exactly on this Temple Mount, on this Mount Moriah. Rome became Christian again, though, eventually, under the group called the Byzantine Empire, okay? And a guy named Constantine was the Christian Roman emperor who went into Israel and kind of tore down a lot of these pagan things. He tore down this temple, took it down. For about 200 years, the area remained vacant, okay? And by the way, I should mention, too, his mother had a lot to do with a lot happening in Israel in terms of even building the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, another story. But anyway, for about 200 years, this remained vacant, this Temple Mount area. Well, it was not significant. In 543, Emperor Justinian built a church on the Temple Mount. So Justinian is another Roman emperor in this area of time called the Byzantine Empire. That was called the Church of St. Mary. Then that was burned down by the Persians. Look at all this that happened on this very same place. It's amazing. In 614, they burned that church down. Then the first Muslim occupation comes in about 636. All right. And it's conquered by the Muslims in 638. About 6 years after Muhammad had died, they came in and they conquered Jerusalem. This is very important to understand this whole story. Now, when they expanded during this time of Muhammad, it was incredibly fast. They were just vicious fighters. They conquered this whole area just in the 7th century. That area in green, you can see these arrows, all of it, including the area around Israel, Jerusalem. All of that was conquered from these incredibly vicious, efficient fighters. Now, see where it says Umayyads in white up there. The group of Muslims that lived in that area up there wanted to kind of make the center of Islam, or the center of the Muslim faith, to be up in Jerusalem. So here's why that's significant. These Umayyads, their leader is called a caliph. That's like a title. Named Malik, decided he wanted to build the Dome of the Rock right here. Why? Well, he knew the story of what had happened there and all these other buildings that once stood there. And he decided to put it right there because in his view, Islam would be the last and greatest, and it would replace everything else that happened. So that's where the Dome of the Rock started, right then, right at that moment. It was kind of refined and improved over the years, but on this very same rock, in exactly the same place. And again, inside, the Umayyads begin the story that later was developed that Muhammad ascended to heaven from this rock, that Muhammad had been here, and he had, even though this was built after the time of Muhammad, that he had been here, he had ascended to heaven from this rock. So this whole story, then, they're starting to develop another version of it. Now, in the Quran itself, there is no mention of Jerusalem. It's not even in there one time, which is interesting. So these Umayyads, this whole idea, they were trying to fabricate this because they wanted to, they lived in that area and they wanted to make that the center. Obviously, in the Bible, there's 806 references to Jerusalem. So clearly, it's Jerusalem central in the Bible, obviously. Now, there's a surah in the Quran. A surah is kind of like a verse, which says, "Worthy of praise is he who took his servant by night from the sacred mosque to the Al-Aqsa mosque." Now, Al-Aqsa means distant or farthest mosque, the precincts which we have blessed. All right. Now, the sacred mosque was definitely in Mecca. That was the origin of Islam. That's where Muhammad initially lived. And Muhammad actually moved up to Medina and he captured that area. There are many Jews up there who were killed. That whole area was mostly Jewish, but there was a mosque built up there called the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was called like the furthest mosque, the furthest from Mecca initially. This is where initially it was. So we have these two mosques. Now, why am I telling you that? Because it's significant in terms of what's going to happen next. Back up to Jerusalem, back up to this Temple Mount. These Umayyads that I mentioned to you, that they kind of wanted to put the center of Islam up here into this area because this is where they are initially from. They did something with that verse. They said that Al-Aqsa, the furthest mosque, was not Medina. It was Jerusalem. It was on the Temple Mount right here. So that verse from the Quran, they said, no, this took place here. And in 705, they built a mosque, which they said this is Al-Aqsa. And it's right here. This is it. This is a source of great contention to this very day between Jews and Muslims. But that's called Al-Aqsa. And so that was kind of to replace Medina, to put it up here on this very site. By the way, the Dome of the Rock is not actually a mosque. It's more like a monument over that rock. But the Al-Aqsa actually is a mosque. So here it is from above. It's very large inside. It's a huge area. This is from way up high. We're looking down on the Temple Mount. The ruins beyond there are part of David's city. Okay. All right, we'll take a look at kind of a very informative short little video about the Temple Mount. This is from Preserving Bible Times.
This view of the Temple Mount, with the Mount of Olives in the background, is from the northwest. The crowded old city is clearly visible. The camera then provides a close-up of the Temple Mount platform, and specifically, the gold Dome of the Rock, or, as it is sometimes called, the Mosque of Omar. This shrine, one of the most important in the Islamic world, was begun in 688 and finished in 691. Many Christians and Jews believe the structure stands where the Israelites' second temple was before its destruction by the Romans. The small dome, supported by 17 columns in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, is called the Dome of the Chain. Its original purpose remains unclear, in spite of many legends that attempt to provide answers.
All right. Now, the Dome of the Rock, compared to the Holy Sepulchre, they kind of line up here. One of the intentions when they built the Dome of the Rock was to make it look more glorious, more beautiful than the Holy Sepulchre. Now, the Holy Sepulchre was initially built before the Dome of the Rock, but let's draw a couple circles or a couple squares. There's the Dome of the Rock, and here's the Holy Sepulchre. And if you look at them, you can see that they do line up pretty much here. And pretty clearly, the Dome of the Rock is, it's gold colored and it kind of outshines the Holy Sepulchre. And that was intentional. Now, just moving ahead here, we're not going into any details at all, but we had this time period of the Crusades, which came up next. And part of that was the Christians trying to reclaim the land. A lot of this that happened was not good. We'll get into that in a future date a little bit. So that happened next. And then we're going to see this big empire, this Ottoman Empire take over. That would be present-day Turkey, called Anatolia, the actual peninsula back then. But it was in force for 400 years, a long, long time, a big part of the history of this area. And generally, not a lot of interest in Jerusalem during this time period among the Ottomans, except for this guy, Suleiman the Magnificent, he was called. Kind of a proud name here, I guess. And he actually had a degree of tolerance, and he helped rebuild Jerusalem walls. In fact, many of the walls today in Jerusalem, some of the actual blocks in there were by him, were built by him. You can see a couple of arrows here, and that's the wall, part of the wall that he helped build around the city, or had built. And a lot of this is over top of more ancient walls. And the reason I'm pointing this out is something kind of interesting here. If you see where it said David's City and Lower City, the walls cut off David's City and the lower city of Jerusalem. The lower city was part of the initial expansion of Jerusalem, but it was cut off. He had builders go in there and build the walls, but they messed it up. They didn't do it right. They put them in the wrong place. They cut off part of and this is where the walls actually still are to this very day. In this drawing, we can see a couple other examples of this. The white drawing on the right is kind of roughly where these two architects built the walls, and then above, that's where they are today. But of course, they did cut off part of the lower city and David's City. Suleiman was not happy, and unfortunately for the architects, he had them executed. Now, there was very little interest in Israel itself, the land, during the Ottoman Empire ownership of this area. Mark Twain visited here in 1869 and wrote an account called Innocents Abroad. He described Israel as a desolate country whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse, a desolation. We never saw a human being on the whole route, hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire had lost. They were sided with Germany, and they lost. And so they lost their influence, and the Jews started to return in large numbers during that time period. Now, and this is kind of a picture of what they went through trying to reclaim Israel, because it was a disaster. It was swampy in places in the north, and particularly in the Galilee regions. Many of them got malaria just trying to drain the swamps and trying to reclaim the land. Jeremiah prophesied about this. He said, "This is what the Lord said. You say about this place, it's a desolate place without people or animals." Well, that prophecy definitely came true, as we heard from Mark Twain. But there was a lot of human suffering by the Jews in order to try to return this land to anything usable. And as I mentioned, they began to return actually in the later 19th century in pretty large numbers, especially in the 20th century, to reclaim the land. Now, it's quite often said today among Muslim authorities that there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. But of course, that was not true, and even by their own words. In 1924, the Supreme Muslim Council, this is exactly what they had written. The site is one of the oldest in the world. Its sanctity dates from the earliest times. Its identity with the site of Solomon's temple is beyond dispute. This too is the spot, according to a universal belief, on which David built there an altar unto the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So that was actually recorded in 24, but of course that is not referred to. Now, from AD 70, the Roman destruction of the temple, until 1967, Israel did not have control of the Temple Mount until the 6 Days War. Now, we're not going to talk about that war right now, but after the war was over, they reclaimed the Temple Mount area. These are some pictures of them coming back into this region for the very first time for all these years, blowing the shofar, celebrating. It was a great event. This rabbi, his name is Rabbi Goren. He's quite famous back then. He was blowing the shofar at that moment, kind of reclaiming back, even at the time of Abraham, that we are here again. We're in control of this area. This is ours because God once gave it to us. Now, in 67, a lot of people thought immediately that Israel would begin to maybe look at reconstructing the temple. And there was a lot of talk about that. But these two men right here had a big influence on that. The one on the left is Moshe Dayan. He was the chief commander in this really brilliant commander in this 1967 war. And the guy on the right is the Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol. Between the two of them, they decided to not do that. In fact, they even gave authority of the Temple Mount back to the Muslims, back to a group called the WAC, the Religious Muslim Authority. And then since 1994, the WAC has been under the influence of the country of Jordan. So Jordan technically influences, under their influence, they have control of the Temple Mount. Israel provides the police force, but Jordan has the actual authority over the Temple Mount. In this picture here, you can see Jews, religious Jews near the Temple Mount. They're actually by the Western Wall praying and gathering together. And that ramp up above is the one and only entrance the non-Muslims have to use to get up to the Temple Mount. It is difficult to get in. There's very limited hours. It's very crowded. And it's once you try to enter the Temple Mount, when you enter, you are told you cannot have a Bible, you cannot have any type of religious documents. And also you cannot pray or have like discussions up there. So it's very, very strict. Even though this is Israel, that's the way it's done. Unbelievably. Now there's only the one entrance for non-Muslims. There's 10 other entrances for Muslims. So they make it much, much easier for them. Now a lot of that is the fact that Jordan is in control. Now once up there, harassment is very common. I've seen plenty of it, especially for Jewish rabbis or people that are considered to be more devout Jews. They are really followed closely. And they are not supposed to pray, as I mentioned, or read any type of religious books, have discussions. I'm hearing it's changing slightly since I've been there. So that's a good thing, and hopefully it keeps going that direction. Now, in the late 1990s, the Muslim Temple Mount authorities began constructing something on the Temple Mount that become very devastating, and I want to show you where it was. I'm going to draw a circle right here, that area. They started to dig in that area to create a new entrance to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is just to the above it there, you can see. And once upon a time, this is what was there. This is Solomon's colonnade. This is, of course, way back during the time of Jesus. This is where the Sanhedrin met. But today it was just as I showed you before. Now, this is what they did. They dug into the Temple Mount, dug deep, just dozens and dozens of truckloads of dirt and debris and all these artifacts from beneath the Temple Mount and dumped it in mostly into the Kidron Valley. And what they're doing is they're creating this, entrances to the Al-Aqsa Mosque from the side. Now, devout Jews watching this in horror, they couldn't believe it was going on, but they couldn't stop it. But what happened with these truckloads of all of this that they had dumped in the Kidron Valley and other places was there was a decision to go through it and to try to determine, what could they find out of it, to try to show, there was a Jewish temple up there, and we're gonna find some artifacts. So there was a whole group of people who started and working on this project for years. There was some archaeologists that were the specialists heading this whole thing up. Now, this is me, and I'm working on it at one point in time, or just on one day. helping with the project. There was like tens of thousands of people have helped on this over time. And what was found here is just incredible. They found so many different things that underneath that Temple Mount, as you might imagine. I found a lot of animal bones. Of course, there were tons and tons of sacrifices up there in that area. But what has been found are coins, and they can actually reconstruct what the temple floor looked like from all the tiles and that kind of thing. But just really rich in terms of findings. So they didn't let this go to waste. They literally put this together and tried to figure out what exactly can we find. It was really quite something. This is a shirt that I got from working on it. I dig Jerusalem. I thought that's kind of cool. So anyway, now there's a prophecy that about the Temple Mount, that what still needs to happen. And let's see what that's about. Well, this has to happen. What's this? Okay, look at it close. You can see modern day Jerusalem in the background, and you can see a temple on the Temple Mount again. Now, how's that going to work? Why does it need to happen? What is this prophecy? What are we talking about here? Well, he, the Antichrist, will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Now, this is in reference to the end of days. This is in reference to what's coming. And how could that possibly happen if there's no temple? So there obviously has to be a temple built. There's no way of knowing how that's going to work. But at some point, it's going to work. It's going to happen. Okay? And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, this is in reference to a figure called the Antichrist, who's going to kind of capture the population. A lot of people are going to at first believe in him for about three and a half years, and then all of a sudden he's going to, in this temple that maybe he helped create. We don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe he comes up with this peace plan. It's really hard to know. But anywhere you look at it, he at some point halfway through is going to literally expose himself in terms of being he's not at all for this. He's totally against it. He's going to desecrate the temple. And that temple, of course, the question is, how is it going to be built in that area? That's the ultimate question. And Jesus has said, so when you see standing in the holy place, the temple, the abomination that causes desolation. Okay, now some people had said, well, this was a prophecy that was fulfilled many years ago, the events of Hanukkah, but no, because Jesus is talking about this happening in the future, and Hanukkah happened before his time period. So this is a coming event. This is something that's going to happen on a new temple. Jesus has spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand, and then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So in order for this to happen, how in the world is a temple ever going to be built if the Dome of the Rock sits up on this very place? Now, there's a little discussion that the Dome of the Rock may be just slightly left, slightly right, forward, backwards, of exactly where it stood, but it's in the spot. So that probably doesn't even make any difference because it's right there. It's right in that area. So how's that going to happen? Well, maybe this is a prophecy that's going to take place. It could be this. There's a prophetic description of a massive earthquake taking place during this time period. I don't know if that's it or there's going to be some kind of an agreement. This is some Israel news from not too long ago. Third temple closer than ever as the search begins for eligible high priests. That's pretty fascinating. This little building right here is called the Temple Institute. It's called Treasures of the Temple. I've been in there several times. They have created all the instruments that they need for the new temple, interestingly enough, in this building. And it's what a fascinating place to visit. I couldn't take any pictures directly inside, but I have some pictures of some of the individual items. Are the priestly robes. They have been recreated, and they've been searching for the priests in line to try to identify who would be the priests of this new temple once we get it built. This is out on display out in the street, the menorah. Okay, that's all to specifications that are outlined in the Torah. Okay, this would be the table of showbread. Now, these are all things that they're going to use in this new temple once it's built. The altar of incense, okay? And Now, and since the ground has been desecrated up here, and before a new temple can be dedicated, it must be purified by the ashes of the red heifer. Okay, this is a really big problem because there isn't any red heifers. They have been gone for years, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. There have been no red heifers. So it's a really big problem. According to the Mishnah, Jewish writings, the last high priest to kill a red heifer was around 60 AD. The ashes could be stored for about a decade, and that's it. Now, these are efforts in the United States. A red heifer would simply be red cows. Of trying to genetically engineer red cattle that could be used for this. And these are rabbis that are checking to see if they would qualify because they can't have any white hairs in them. They need to be red. So it's interesting, this whole story. And what they would do is there's this whole mixture of sacrificing the animal and using its ashes in a mixture and sprinkling it on the ground to purify it before they could build a brand new temple. All right. What about the Ark of the Covenant? Well, it's interesting. In Jeremiah, it talks about the fact that the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, it will never be enter their minds or be remembered. It will not be missed, nor will another one be made. Okay, because it's not here. So I don't think that's an issue because it's simply not going to be there. Then the final battle takes place. Okay. Now these are the events that are coming, the final events. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. And Armageddon, as you remember from previous times, is that valley near Megiddo. Har Megiddo. Har means mountain or hill. It's not really a mountain, it's just a small hill. This ancient city on the trade route overlooks that valley. That's where the kings are going to gather. The armies are going to gather. In that valley are the most battles ever fought anywhere on earth. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. So that's where they're going to ultimately go. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. So Jesus is going to return and he's going to win this battle, this incredible battle over Jerusalem. And he will stand on the Mount of Olives, exactly where he left, where he ascended. On the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. The Lord will be king over the whole earth, and on that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name. This is from Zechariah 14. Ezekiel prophesies when the Messiah returns, there's going to be one more temple be built. That's interesting. That's not something we normally pick up on. And Ezekiel describes it in tremendous detail, chapters 40 to 47. We refer to it kind of like as a messianic temple because it's very different than anything else. And then Zechariah, he also has reference to this. He says, tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here's a man whose name is Branch, and he will branch out from this place and build a temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty and will sit on its throne. So Jesus is going to build this temple. How fascinating. This is going to be from where he's going to rule and reign from Jerusalem. Obviously, he can go wherever, but this is going to be like this central location. But what's so interesting about this temple described in Ezekiel is it has no menorah. It has no table of showbread. It doesn't have an altar of incense. There's no ark. There's no veil. There's no laver, wall of petition. None of that's there. And that has got, of course, the rabbis, many of them, confused about what is that temple all about. Well, as Christians, we know it doesn't need a menorah because the light of the world is here. Table of showbread because the bread of life. And all of these things. Jesus is a fulfillment of everything, of all those previous temples. So it's kind of like a memorial temple that's going to be built. This ultimate last final temple that will be there. And in the ultimate conclusion, this is what the Lord says. I will return to Zion and dwell in Jerusalem. Then Jerusalem will be called the faithful city, and the mountain of the Lord Almighty will be called the holy mountain. Now we're going full cycle here from the very, very beginning. Jesus is going to be returning to this very place. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord. See that? And all the nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. Wow. What an incredible story. The whole thing is going to come back from likely those very beginnings. If the Garden of Eden was there, which I think it might be very likely, the very place of creation, and all this story through all of history. And I know I've covered an awful lot here that made this a little bit lengthy. But ultimately, it's not over, because this is going to be the final conclusion of everything, and it's going to be on this very same place. Wow, this Temple Mount area. Well, thank you today for watching this. And my wish for you, as all these events are going to be transpiring and there's so much happening, even today, there's so much going on in Israel almost on a daily basis. It's fascinating to watch. But my wish for you is shalom.